All right. So this is an interesting sort of experiment that we're doing here. What's the best place to start, do you think?
We could start anywhere. But so first of all, where do you live now? In the Midwest?
Yes, I'm currently in Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay. But you're from Arizona?
No, I'm from Utah.
Oh, okay.
I did spend 6 weeks in Arizona on my mission.
Okay. That's what it was. Weren't you in like my neighborhood at some point?
I was, yes. I spent my 6 weeks there in the Kensington and Cooley Park wards. So I just, we probably crossed vision lines at some point, but no more because there are a lot of people in that region who are members.
Yes, definitely. So your mission was just Arizona, or?
No. So I was assigned to the Sydney North mission.
Oh, that's right.
To visa wait for 6 weeks, yeah. So I got to spend some time in a lovely mesa with plenty of orange trees and such, and then I went to the big city.
Was your visa delayed or something?
Yes. It was. I don't know what the status has been more recently, but at least at that time, there was fairly, not always, but a lot of times, there were a lot of people who would end up waiting for their visa for a few months here or there and then get to their actual mission location.
I've known a lot of people do that. Yeah. And when I was in the MTC too, there were a lot of people who had a period in the United States while their visas were going in.
Yeah.
Paraguay visas are really easy to get though. So
Paraguay is where you served then?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. It's a piece of cake to get visas there. I think now actually, I think you can get one on arrival.
Really?
Yeah. If it's a tourist visa.
Right.
But back then, I think either we needed a different type of visa or we were just sending them in beforehand. I don't remember if the laws were different back then, but every time I've gone there, I've mailed it into the embassy beforehand. But yeah, I guess it's visa on arrival now.
Nice. That sounds much more convenient.
It's a nice way to do it. I like it when countries set it up that way.
Yeah. I remember Brazil was one of the big visa waiting countries when I went out, where everyone would have to wait, sometimes even 7, 8, 9 months. I think there were a couple of missionaries in Australia who were from Australia going to Brazil who ended up visa waiting in Australia.
Okay. Yeah, my wife and I went on vacation in South America, and I remember Brazil was one of the trickier ones. I sent that one into a place. I think we sent it to an agent or something, and then he took it down to the embassy or something like that. I don't remember how we had it all worked out, but
right.
It was a little bit more complicated than the others.
So when you say in South America, you were traveling around several South American countries.
Yeah. We went to Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, and Peru.
Very cool. That is, other than Africa, that's the part of the world I've had like the least personal contact with. So,
but have you been there?
No, not at all. So I've been to Europe, I've been to Asia, I've been to Australia, I've been around a good number of places at this point, but never anywhere south of Arizona or Texas in the Western Hemisphere.
So where in Asia?
In Asia, I went to Taiwan. I spent a month in Taiwan.
Okay. I was wondering about that because I know, with your studies in Mandarin. So was that part of it?
Yes.
Was that like one of the reasons you were going there?
That was the whole reason. Yeah, it was a month of study abroad and exchange program with a university there, and so I just got to spend a month as a Chinese student in Taipei, which was absolutely fantastic because I don't know, every time I feel like for me going to one of those like East Asian megacities is what the experience of going from similar to what the experience of going from a developing country to a developed country feels like in the sense of their cities compared to our cities in terms of convenience of public transport, in terms of level of interest I have in the things there and everything. It just feels on an entirely different level than going around some of the cities around me. So it's a fantastic experience.
So you were quite impressed with the their their transit system and all that.
Absolutely. And like their outdoor markets are absolutely fantastic. Just everything there, the look of it, the style, you have all these really cool, like neonish alleyways. And one really random trait of it, you've got like a bunch of claw machines like you would not believe. You have roomfuls, like open spaces of like 30 or so claw machines or more on almost every street corner.
So what, a claw machine just like for lifting things, or?
No, like those little games where you have little plushes and everything.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So Toy Story, the claw. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere. There's this obsession in, at least there was when who knows, it might be different now. But when I went there was this bizarre obsession with claw machines and all sorts of plushes you could get from them.
Oh,
so
nice.
It was absolutely hilarious.
So, with your study in Mandarin, did you started on your mission?
I did, yes. So I was an English-speaking missionary, unfortunately. Ups and downs. But I was one of my first areas, and the first area that I really, really enjoyed had just this incredible amount of overseas Chinese students. And right next to us were a bunch of missionaries who were assigned to speak Chinese. My companion at the time was assigned to speak Korean and everything. And that really planted the seed, like being around so many English, Chinese, bilingual people, or people who were just learning languages and everything. I had never been interested before that. Like I remember in high school, I had a friend who was like, oh yeah, I'm going to take Chinese. And I thought, wow, what a pointless thing to do. Like I'd rather study German or something cool.
So that was offered at the high school?
It was offered at the high school he was going to. It was like in the last year of junior high, we were discussing high school stuff. Okay. It was offered in his high school. It wasn't offered in mine. But I was like, if it was, I still wouldn't have taken it. But there I was on my mission, starting, getting seed planted and everything. And so towards the end, there was a time when I spent a transfer or two in a very, very small town out in the middle of absolute nowhere. And it got dark early on. There was little to do late at night. And I was looking around and like, hey, President, can I start studying Chinese?
Yeah. And he was good with that. Well, that's really good. Yeah. Because a lot of times they'll want like 100% focus on whatever the calling was. Like this is your language, this is what you study. But that's right. Nice that he gave you that flexibility.
Yeah, I think it was good.
So did you how did you go about that? Because I'm very interested in, basically anything self-taught, especially language, is very impressive.
Right.
And these days, self-teaching is pretty much what I do, since I work full-time and, I'm not an official student, but including with languages. So I'm just interested to hear of other people's experiences with that.
So it was one of the most oddly intellectually fulfilling experiences I've had that started learning Chinese, because I had at the start very, very few materials. One of my friends, like one of the recently baptized young single adults in one of the wards, who was from China, had gifted me like this entry-level Chinese learning textbook that had one CD with pronunciations and stuff that I would listen to. And then I had like a study Book of Mormon that had like the Chinese characters, the pinyin, transliterations, and then the English. And what I would do, I would like start out just listening to the CD and practicing the pronunciations. And I would spend a while just practicing the pronunciations from that, very basic. And I would pull out the Book of Mormon and really I would just decode. I would be looking around, like comparing, just going through like a chapter, usually that I was somewhat familiar with the English one, in the Chinese, and look for like, oh, hey, this must be, and it came to pass and such. And this must be this must be this must be this. And it was not really doing a lot at first, but it was just like letting me sort of get my foot in the door with the language, get a toehold in, whatever. And then I had this wonderful gift from another missionary of the set of like 600 flashcards that they used to really jumpstart their study way back at the start of their mission. So I went through and spent a week I get really obsessive about things sometimes. So I just spent a week or so diving in, learned this whole box of flashcards that turned out to be almost exactly the language of Preach My Gospel and the little pamphlets that we used. And then at that point, it was one of the strangest experiences I've had with a language, in that I wasn't learning the pronunciations at that time. I was learning, this is the character, this is the meaning. So what would happen when I read it is I would be reading through and I would get the meaning and have no idea how to say it at first, which is an experience possible with Chinese and pretty much no other language.
Mm-hmm.
And it was fascinating. But that's really how I started, and then I just kind of spiraled from there until I started actual formal instruction.
So I'm doing a little bit of Mandarin study now. I've started increasing a little bit, but I've noticed the same thing. I mean, I'm trying to include the sounds as well, but I've also noticed that too, where I'm kind of focusing on the symbol at the moment. And a lot of the times I can remember the symbol, but not the sound that goes with it.
Right.
So I'm kind of having that same experience where it's the visual part that is coming first.
Yeah, it's a
cool
feeling.
language. I can see how it would get really addicting. Well, and I get addicted to languages I've studied as well.
Yeah. See, the sad thing is, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say there were other. So there were missionaries in Australia who were speaking Chinese as well.
Yes. There were a good number of missionaries who were specifically assigned to Chinese speaking, and then several of my companions, in fact, towards the end, were Taiwanese missionaries who were coming there learning English, or there were also a good number of mainland Chinese missionaries who were coming on missions to Australia and learning English there.
Okay. Thanks.
And that was fascinating. They had extraordinary stories, all of them. Some of them, one of them, or several of them were baptized in China, having heard about the church through some odd route in China. And anyway, so it was, I would say it's possible that I met more Chinese people than Australians while I was there.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yes.
And then I assume that accelerated after your mission?
So it sort of took a hold, got put on hold for a while I was in college and everything, going back there. And then when I dropped out and started this job and everything, and they were like, okay, you go learn Chinese. That's when it really picked up again. And that's when I actually, became properly proficient in the language and everything.
For your job. Okay.
Yes.
Nice. And I'd imagine the immersion was a big part of that as well.
Right.
And did you take formal classes?
Right. So they just stuck me in about a year and a half of formal classes and everything, and had native teachers, all that.
Hold on just a second. One of my daughters.
Go ahead.
Something. I'll be right back.
Yep.
Then she put in one of her toys that it's like a toy that guesses an animal that it has in mind and asks you yes or no questions. Anyway, she just threw that in. It was something we got at a dollar store or a thrift store or something that she thinks is pretty funny.
Oh, kids. I am very excited for the day when I have my own kids. But that's not coming up for a while. Yeah. Good times.
They're quite entertaining.
Yeah. So one thing I'm always curious about with return missionaries and such, especially people who have fairly nuanced views of the gospel, is what was your mission experience notable for? Like, what were the standout elements of it for you? The things that really stick in your mind
of my mission individually,
right?
So that's a good question. My mission was pretty relaxed on, there weren't extra rules, I would say. And so we were given a lot of autonomy. And I think I was very much given over to my own study of the scriptures, and learning. It was a time when I spent a lot of time just reading the scriptures, thinking about different gospel topics, which turns into just thinking about life in general, and kind of working those out with my companions and just in conversations with the people that I had. And I guess it kind of developed a way of thinking deeply about important issues, especially existential issues, and of course, important religious issues. I thought differently about things back then than I started to later in life. It was more of a traditional religious outlook.
So you had a fairly traditional experience.
Oh, sure. There wasn't anything that was, I guess, unusual for a young guy in his late teens and early 20s. But as far as what it impacted on my life, it was very transformative. There's sometimes in our culture we make fun of the recent returned missionary for just being obsessed with this mission. Can never talk about anything else. But it also kind of makes sense because, well, for one thing, if once you get back, it's the past 2 years of your life. So that's the reserve of experiences that you're going to refer to, and then also it is so transformative. In being in Paraguay, it's just a different world. It's not a completely different culture. It's still a Western culture, but it is different. Different language, mostly Catholic, different religion, and different culture, different way of seeing things. It was just something that I refer back to all the time. Thinking, and it gives a different view of what the world is, So, United States is one way of being in the world, but living in South America, I knew people from Paraguay, knew people from Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Guatemala, and got to talk with those people and get their perspectives on things and the way that they saw things, and get a more broad perspective of what the world is like. Even though that was still with members of the church, it was quite varied. It was actually kind of interesting to see also, like, in as far as doctrine, not much divergence, but politically, I have this idea of like what Latter-day Saints are like. There tends to be Republican, conservative, where that doesn't really apply in other countries that don't have those party systems. They have their own party systems, and they can have very different views because it's not obvious that in being a member of the church or from reading the scriptures that one way of thinking about things is going to fall out of that, even though that might be the usual interpretation that's given, when you're in Utah or Arizona, or I assume the whole part of the country, the Western U.S.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, so there are socialist missionaries, very left-wing missionaries, and or neoliberal, as they would tend to call themselves, more than conservative. But
wait, they would self-identify as neoliberal?
I don't know if they would self-identify as that, but neoliberal would be more like the pro-business,
right,
type of perspective. But yeah, just being a Chilean socialist would not be a big deal, whereas in the United States, that's maybe not so much now, but that would have been seen as more unusual, especially as a member of the church. Like, oh, that'd be incompatible, but
right, Ezra Taft Benson said.
Right, yeah. But then you step back and think about it. I was like, well, actually, no, I guess it's not actually that incompatible. Unless you're getting into, if you think automatically Stalin or Mao Zedong,
right.
The more violent tactics, but that's not what like the Socialist Party in Chile would be, for instance.
Right.
It's something much more respectable, as I would put it. Yeah. But yeah, it was. It's actually one of those things I've thought, like, even if with my own children, if they didn't go on a mission, I'd want them to do something.
Yes.
Similar, as some type of service, something that is outside of just the usual, the place where you grew up, same culture that you've seen all the time. Get out there, see other things, and learning the language is very good too.
Right.
And so that's why I think it's neat that even though that wasn't what you were called to, that you did it also.
Snuck that in there.
Snuck it in. Yeah, you still got that experience. Yeah,
definitely. But yeah, that's one of the major dilemmas I find in my own life. Is I really did feel essentially that I had no choice but to step away from activity in the church when I did. Mm-hmm. However, I really like a lot of structural things like missions very much. And my own mission experience was extremely complicated in the sense of it contained the very worst times of my life alongside some really powerful and memorable and good experiences. And it left me a little bit broken at the end, I would say. But also it did play so much of this molding role, so much of this bringing me into who I am and establishing the ideas that I cared about and that I wanted to think about, and that sort of exposure to the world, exposure to different slices of life, exposure to so much, and experiencing the world in such a very different way than you have the opportunity to in regular life, that I'm sort of looking around and saying, well, other institutions need to hurry up and get their act together because things like this have a genuinely useful role to play. Yeah. And if I no longer have access to this one, what the heck, everyone else? Like,
yeah. Yeah. And is that, you're the institutions guy, right?
I am. Yes.
So I remember at my birthday thing when we were doing, Jackbox, it was like institutions for everything, building institutions.
I only said that once.
Oh, okay.
But Jared brought it up again.
No, that was the joke anyway.
But yes, I'm obsessive lately about institutions.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and a mission is definitely one of those things. And I was very, I would say I was pretty into that type of structure, the norms and regulations. I tried to really get into preach my gospel and kind of memorize it, not word for word, but know it really well, and be shaped by it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So like when I got home, I gave a lesson to the priest quorum, and gave in my lesson was basically the first chapter of Preach My Gospel about the call to repentance and how that's central to what a mission is, and gave a very standard, but I thought it was good and compelling, and basically presentation based on Preach My Gospel. Just kind of the thinking like, okay, I'm not going to project my own ideas on, this has been set up. This is what I should follow. And I think that is definitely good to a certain extent. Not that every person can't contribute their own unique perspective on it. But I agree that the institution adding something to you, allowing yourself to be shaped by something rather than being all self-directed, is good as well. Anything that challenges you can lead to growth.
Yeah.
And yeah, the church in general does that, and missions certainly do.
Yes. Yeah, I remember going into my mission, and there are a couple of important aspects of that overall structure for me. The first was the testimony I bore right before my mission was me getting up and saying, I don't know whether the church is true.
Okay.
I believe it is, and I hope it is, and I see a lot of good in it. And this is everything I was saying to the congregation that I'd spent my whole life growing up in. And I'm like, but I really don't know, and I'm going out intending to understand whether the church is true. And there was that tension, that struggle, that whole intellectual side of things. And then there was this secondary, very much committed to obedience side of it, where I was that sort of person who was like, of course, all of these things are, I was very, very into that. All of this, if it's from God, you follow it.
Yeah.
If we're being told to do this, then I'm going to do every bit of it.
This was before your mission? Or going into it?
On my mission. Going into and throughout my mission, like every rule, every guideline, every suggestion, every hint of a suggestion is something that we should be following. And I was always one of the ones who would end up fairly intense about it. There was a companion I had who was very, very lax about the rules. And it was really funny because I was very, very stressed about the idea of breaking any rules. And he didn't care about the rules at all. But we were both not wanting to actually upset each other or anything. Neither of us disliked or had negative feelings towards the other or anything. So it became this really interesting wrestle of him being willing to comply with the rules to keep me sane, and me being willing to overlook some small things to keep him sane.
Yeah.
Anyway, that side of things carried out throughout my mission. And I've always been very much of the obedience mold of things.
Well, yeah, I'm definitely a rule follower generally. So my wife thinks it's either hilarious or kind of annoying because sometimes to get things done requires a little bit of pushing and shoving, and so I kind of look the other way while she will do the dirty work sometimes, whether it's cutting in line or pushing in line, or maybe metaphorically speaking. But yeah, I'm very much one who doesn't like to bring attention to myself for breaking rules, and I think that's generally works out for the best.
Right.
But it's probably good that I'm married to who I am married to as well, so that we can have both the I guess kind of the stability, but also somebody who's willing to push the envelope at times.
Right. I would say it's specifically within the context of the church that I was such an intense rule follower, and outside of that context, it's very contextually dependent for me. In part because some rules feel much more serious than other rules. There are some rule systems that are set up fundamentally where they basically expect a lot of small gray areas will constantly be happening, and the whole structure sort of continues by ignoring that those gray areas are happening. And in those structures, I'm like, okay, sure, I'll do whatever. Or there are times when I'll go out and just do things like hitchhike around the United States because that seems like a compelling thing to do.
You've done that?
I have. And if it's technically illegal in Utah, then they probably won't bother me.
Yeah.
But then
hitchhiking's illegal in Utah?
It is, unfortunately.
I've never had reason to know that, but
right. It's something that most people don't have reason to know.
Yeah.
It's a shame because I think hitchhiking is one of the most elegant concepts around, one of the most satisfying things, just to be able to leave one place and without any means of transport of your own, purely by the winds of chance, be able to end up someplace completely different. And it's incredibly satisfying, and there's a fascinating history to it all, but it fell very much out of fashion in the 70s, 80s, whenever, and hasn't ever come back, and I think that's a shame. So I went out hitchhiking and had an absolute blast doing it, because it turns out you can do things like that. Like, there's no one holding up a sign saying you are not allowed to do this.
Yeah.
And it just takes the whims of a few strangers, and then you're fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, when it came to things like thinking, and part of it was this whole, I want to know that this is true. You can't know that without actually, within that structure, there's the idea you can't know it without obedience. You can't know that without putting in the work. And I was like, I'd better be putting in all possible legwork and dotting all my I's, crossing all my T's, doing everything if I want any chance at coming to some deeper spiritual understanding of this all. And so that's sort of what motivated my rule following more than, it's hard to say how much my innate tendency is to follow rules versus just contextually that was what made sense.
Well, yeah, that you would have certain benefits from following the rules and answers.
Not even certain benefits, but that if this is true, which I'm trying to figure out, then you need to follow it, and you need to follow everything. And also, I got obsessed a little bit with all these, there are these talks and things that float around missions, like the consecrated missionary or the whatever, these stories of people who, do exactly what they should, and then miracles flow in, and God works through them in such and such and such way. And, I was like, well, I'm not out to take any half measures here. And, it all spirals and adds up and everything. And there was an element of magical thinking for me. Yeah. Definitely. Where I was like, there is basically that if you put all the pieces in place in just such a way, then there will be some remarkable, magnificent spiritual shift, and things will happen differently in the world fundamentally, in this, God will intervene, his hand will guide, and do this and this and this, which incidentally also ended up being what became the core heartbreak of my mission.
Okay. Yeah.
And that didn't happen as such. But that was,
I attended, there's a organization here in the Phoenix area, or East Mesa area, called Ditat Deus. And it's basically a group of LDS people who just like to get together and invite a speaker to come and share what their research is, usually like an academic or somebody who writes books, articles. So anyway, we recently had Thomas Wayment, who's a BYU professor of classics, and he did a translation of the New Testament. I don't know if you have heard of that one, but so it's a non-KJV translation of the New Testament that's sold, or it's actually published by Deseret Book. And Thomas Wayment's the one who did the translation. So anyway, he spent a lot of time with the New Testament and the Bible, and something he talked about was the experience of people in the Bible in terms of their level of righteousness is quite different. So in the Book of Mormon, a lot of the things that as missionaries we would look to for the obedience was so the stripling warriors, for example, followed every commandment with exactness. Nephi, I must obey, and Ammon as well, that their success was built on doing all these things right, prayer and fasting. And And so giving all the things that they did right, the New Testament gives a lot of examples of the mistakes that people did. So Paul, for example, we have the benefit of having his letters and also a narrative account of his life in Acts. And you can see that Paul had a pretty tumultuous career or mission. He got in a lot of fights, and get the sense that there were some things that he wishes he could have taken back, things he said that he probably shouldn't have said. Then there are prophets in the Old Testament, of course, who weren't really model prophets.
Right.
Kind of like missionaries, because like Jonah, for example, was called
Jonah,
to give a message.
The classic example. Yes.
And also Jeremiah really didn't want to be a prophet, and was kind of compelled to be.
Moses, Aaron,
Moses, was kind of figuring his way out, experimenting, doubting, complaining a lot, and it's a different picture. Yeah. Yes. And but it works out, and it's almost like God or the Spirit is the agent at work, and in spite of their mistakes, in spite of all the things that they do wrong, they're kind of carried along and made instruments in the hand of God in spite of all that, or it's made use of in some way. And maybe we don't read the Bible enough. We should read it a little bit more. Not that that's anything that's lacking in the Book of Mormon, but it's just something that I think the Bible has that the Book of Mormon doesn't have as much.
Right. And I took narratives like that in as well and absorbed all that. I was very church scholarly on my mission, I would say, just because I had only those books, and I'm a compulsive reader. So when I had only this limited amount of stuff to read, I think I read, there was at one point in one of my apartments, I felt extremely dodgy doing this. There was a list of BYU devotionals, and I was like, these aren't technically scriptures on the approved reading list exactly, but they're church, so I think I can. And so I was like a little bit racked by guilt with these, but I would still devour all these BYU devotionals. And I think I ended up reading most BYU devotionals that have been given, and just read Old Testament, New Testament, everything, and just got obsessive about all this, and ended up very much searching for a narrative throughout, being very much, I think I'm always a bit of a narrative driven person. And particularly with something like a mission that so naturally feels like a narrative experience, like you have such a defined start and end, you're going on this quest, you're going out, you're intended to be filling this hero's journey sort of function in so many ways. And I think I really aimed for a narrative and got really frustrated by looking around and being like, that's not, it's just whatever is happening here is a bunch of people doing their thing and interacting with each other in a very human way, and really cool experiences pop out and tendrils of narrative pop in and everything, but no overarching feeling of God's hand guiding and working through all of us or anything like that. Anyway, just this very,
So it felt somewhat
expectation discordant experience.
Didn't have a direction to it.
Well, it had a direction. It was just the wrong direction.
I see. Yeah. I guess not the one you were looking for then.
No. It was my last transfer had an emergency transfer in the middle of it after a series of increasingly erratic and bizarre decisions that I had no control over, including my mission president bringing back a missionary who had previously been transferred out of that area because he was struggling with it and depressed, that whole area had been wiped out, and like new missionaries had been brought in. This mission president brought this missionary back to that exact same area with me, in this bizarre set of circumstances that just, anyway, the whole thing was wild.
Yeah.
But
so with if you're looking for institution building,
yes.
above and beyond the LDS Church, what I think, I agree is a major person shaping institution. Do you see anything out there that's similar or could play that role?
So, yes, sort of. Not in full. I see aspects of things that can play roles like it. I think the military is a fascinating institution for a number of reasons, with the very obvious limitation that it is focused on combat, which obviously the military has a very clear role and a very useful role. Well, so that limitation, and then also just the limitation that people aren't looking for quite the same degree of shaping from the military. So I would say the military as a shaping institution, and particularly things like boot camp, basic training, these experiences are extremely and deliberately shaping experiences. But I would say, like many institutions, and slower than most other institutions, it is being softened a bit away from that shaping form, more to just being another job people do. And so at times I would fill the military in a role like that. Oh, and the other major limitation of it, of course, is that it only really enters into people's lives in adulthood. Which is past the really shaping time. Other than that, so the church and the military are the two that really come to mind. I think high demand religions in general are always going to fill that same sort of shaping function. So if you look around, you find any sort of high demand religion, it is very likely some sort of shaping will be going on. But outside high demand religions, I feel like for the most part that sort of thing is lacking.
What about like online communities? Do you think they can play that role?
I do. The limitation is that they are online, which means that they are going to attract a very eclectic group of people first, and then they are going to involve only interactions, mind-to-mind interactions, versus there's a very different experience you get in person with people. And when you're going out, say, helping someone in your neighborhood move, for example, that's fundamentally a different experience than one that can be replicated online. And so online communities, I think, have a lot of fascinating potential. And I think in the absence of other institutions, whatever is most convenient wins. And right now, online communities are the most convenient for a lot of people, which means online communities are the things that are going to be shaping people most. But they're very much not deliberate communities, and they're very much, they tend towards a very libertarian and or anarchist mindset, broadly, where they are more about self-expression and finding the exact right community than they are about saying, we will mold you.
Well, another thing I was thinking is that they can be kind of self-selecting too, right? If you have a certain interest or affinity with a certain group, maybe you'll become more like what you are already interested in. But less likely that there'll be some major transformation.
Right.
Because if there's something that really challenges you, then you may just say, well, I'm not going to pursue that. That's too unpleasant. That's inconvenient.
Right. I think so. Looking at specifically politics in terms of institutions, and one reason I've become, because I wasn't always very interested in politics, one reason I've become so interested in a lot of political ideas and such was this vague realization, speaking of online communities, starting in, say, a Pokemon community that I was kicking around in when I was like 12 years old, just jumping online for the first time. I'm like, I like Pokemon. Here's an online place to discuss Pokemon and everything.
Yeah.
And you start to realize very quickly that there is a very distinct culture that, as a conservative Mormon kid from Utah, I was thoroughly misaligned with jumping in. There's this very distinct set of cultural ideas and acceptable thoughts in most spaces that have nothing to do with the subject matter at hand, the immediate subject matter at hand, that are taking the norms from some broader something that everyone seemed tuned into, that I was like, okay, I'm tuned into some completely different culture.
It's because Pokemon, I guess, was Pokemon was the immediate subject, but there was a lot more being brought in. Am I understand that correctly?
Well, so like it's a Pokemon forum, but every place online pretty much you'll have people discussing that thing, and then you'll have people who are like, I'm hanging out with friends. Let's just talk about whatever.
Right.
And so I remember there was a debate subforum there, or a bunch of like political discussion things. And I'm hopping in and say there's like a thread on gay marriage, whatever. And here I am, conservative Mormon kid. And I'm like, well, of course, everyone knows like, sexuality is gross and gay marriage is wrong. And, I hop in. And everyone is like, you are the worst person in the world. Yeah,
it's like, that's not the internet opinion to have. Yeah.
Right, it's not.
Yeah.
And what I realized, basically, at some point was that if you are uninterested in a lot of those broader forces, they end up, like, whoever is interested in them controls the dynamic with them, in the sense of the people who are having those conversations and who are determining these are the core ideas that seep into culture and everything. These are the core things that seep into whatever group here or here or here, that those end up, the people who have those conversations end up very much influencing the background noise for everyone who doesn't have those conversations. And so if you're looking around and you're like, well, this culture that I suddenly find it connected to all sorts of random topics doesn't quite fit what I think the culture should be of somewhere, it's because no one is bothering to have those specific conversations at a higher level that are seeping out. And that's where my mind goes with online communities, is like thinking about they're not exactly the ones shaping culture. They do in some ways, but in as many ways they end up reflecting
it,
reflecting it and amplifying it. And there are some communities that I would say are more influential towards shaping, but you see a lot of reflection and amplification going on in a lot of those.
Where do you think that leaves people? So if there's not a shaping institution, does that just leave people with lack of direction or confusion, or what do you think is the downside of that?
Always, my basic philosophy with people, the basic way I understand people is that at any given point, we are likely to do what is most convenient. Just as a general rule of thumb, we are likely to do what is most convenient. And so without specifically putting ourselves in places that shape us, what do we end up doing? Well, we end up being shaped with whatever is shaping us. So say right now, things that fulfill by default a shaping function, schools.
Yeah.
very much fulfill by default this function, and universities. And so right now, it's go to school, go to university, get a job.
Mm-hmm.
And so people just default into, these are the things that shape me. I will be defined by school, and then I will be defined by my university major, and then I will be defined by my job. And political parties, people very much hop into political parties. And I would say that political parties form this shaping function, except that I think they fall short in one of the key areas of it. That is, the goal of political parties in general is to win elections and then to enact their agendas. So when you are participating in partisan politics, your mindset is support this candidate, support this election, do this thing, versus non-electoral politic institutions where your focus is, so contrast, say, a church with a political party. And in a church, you have people going to church on Sunday, and then you have, with Mormonism, say, scout meetings on Tuesday and young women's on Wednesday, and you have all of these community-oriented or organization-focused activities that aren't so much trying to play power games in the broader world so much as say, this is something we are working to build within our group.
Mm-hmm.
And with political parties, it's very much the way you get involved in this is to engage in this broader power struggle. And you don't say, go to a political party meeting where, like, you might go out and try to get out the vote operations, where you might, you'll phone bank, you'll canvass everything. You saw a lot of this where I'd say Bernie Sanders' campaign in specific was this very much institutions seeking to get a lot of energy and get a lot of people doing things, build a lot of things that doesn't really end up building so much as pushing into power struggles in broader institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's interesting. It's interesting you say too how you've become more interested in politics. So I have become less I guess I've gotten away from this just by neglect. But a while ago, a few years ago, I was thinking about the importance of political participation, because what turns me off is the partisanship and the rancor. I'm the type of person who just wants to get along with everyone.
Yes.
And partisan politics is not a good way to do that. And it's very hard to do it in general with politics because people have strong opinions. But working out how a community is going to run and how to organize things to benefit people and to work together, that's basically what politics is. And we lose sight of that sometimes. But in theory, going to city council meetings or PTO meetings or church council meetings even is kind of political in a sense. It doesn't have to have all the rancor, even if it usually does. But getting out there, putting your face in front of a crowd, and putting taking on a little bit of risk, but for the sake of other people, I think is a good thing. There need to be people who do that, that we can't, not all of us have to be political, but not everyone can just sit at home and look after only their own interests as well. There has to be, it's kind of like how we need entrepreneurs. Not everyone has to do it. Most people can't, but somebody's got to do it. And in politics is that way too. And hopefully I would hope that the people who are political, who are, I think of the ancient Athenian state, going to the agora and standing in the middle of the polis and the assembly and making your case, that is people who have a genuine interest and want what's best for the community, that aren't just seeking their own interests, their own pride, that's a good thing to do.
Right.
And I've the closest I got to really, I guess there are a few different approaches. So one was I was thinking of being a precinct committeeman, and I never could really get into it. I went to the committee meetings, and they were kind of interesting, and I think I could have gotten into it. Mesa's kind of like very divided between two wings of the Republican Party. And at the time, that's kind of what I was going to pursue, is participation in the Republican Party, because that's kind of the only party of influence.
Right. If you want to be engaged in Mesa, you're a Republican.
You're basically a Republican. So it's kind of like I was just reading Destiny of the Republic, which is a book about the Garfield assassination, and it was kind of like that back then. There were two wings of the Republican Party, the stalwarts and was it the True Bloods, something like that. There were two wings anyway, almost two parties within a single party. But in Mesa, there's like that as well. There's kind of like more of an establishment type of Republican, more moderate, and then there's I guess more not quite Tea Party necessarily, but kind of more in that direction.
Right. What you would instinctively think of as Tea Party before looking into the precise differences.
Right, yeah.
The more
ultra-conservative type. It was actually good for me because, I went to it, and the people who went to the meetings, it was more on the Tea Party side of things. And to their credit, very engaged. They would show up to the meetings. And I thought, if I'm going to be involved in this, then I need to have respectful relationships with these people, and not have hard feelings, even if there are differences of opinion. And so, that was interesting. And then I just kind of got distracted with other things in life.
Right, as happened.
Yeah. So I'm probably not the one who's most cut out for that. Regardless, though, I think it's a good thing. And those type of institutions, political parties, or the local precinct, are good ways to strengthen democracy. If there are good people in that are participating.
I think they have a useful role to play. My worry is that I think people are trying to extend them to a role beyond that which they were designed for, to a more all-encompassing role where, going back to the idea, like with online communities, you see them reflecting and amplifying. You see people's sense of everything being defined very much, sense of like broader morality, sense of broader what ought to be done, what a public-minded person ought to do, ends up being filtered entirely through this lens, where, say, you have a Mormon, they are probably going to be filtering a lot of their sense of doing good through the church, where they'll be like, oh, I should go do temple work, or I should go, volunteer at the Bishop's Storehouse. I should go do my calling here. I should do my home teaching, whatever. And a lot of their do good mentality is focused in that direction. With political parties, when someone has only a political party, a lot of their do good mentality is focused exclusively in the political direction. And it's an important direction to have, something that people need to be engaged in. But if it's all there is, then what do you do when there isn't an election around? What do you do when your party is out of power? Mm-hmm. What do you do other than really try to go for broke in this zero-sum power struggle so that you can get your group back into doing good things. Where I think the most productive institutions, and I'll pause and say one reason I really think about this is that I'm not really fond conceptually of capitalism, understanding the values of it, understanding the way it makes things work.
Yeah, the utility of it.
The utility.
Yeah.
It's a very utilitarian, useful tool that keeps the world running.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's really important to have things around where people aren't focused at their core on the profit motive.
Yeah.
And I think it's really valuable to have things that are competing in the attention sphere that aren't solely this monetized experience driven by that specific engine. And having other non-business institutions kicking around and working and doing their thing and saying, so sure, you spend this amount of time at work and everything, but after work, you have other useful places to contribute.
Yeah.
And other useful places to give of your time and energy and thought and be valued for other reasons. That's good. And given the flaws I see in most religious institutions, I think a lot of them are good, but if you don't believe in them, you don't believe.
Mm-hmm.
There needs to be something else, but there isn't, other than politics, which people are trying to do. And then
and I don't know if politics makes a very good religion.
It doesn't. That's the issue.
Doesn't seem to work very well. Yeah, and there've been historically there've been lots of attempts at some type of secular replacement. So like temples to reason in the French Revolution, and all these different holidays where they would have secular kind of secular saints, or Auguste Comte in the 19th century tried to set up kind of a religion also, a positivistic religion that was built solely on sense data, nothing supernatural. I mean, to their credit, recognizing the need for some type of institution, something to serve that need that people have in their lives. And so, that's good that they recognize that. But all credit to them for trying. But none of them seem to really pan out and last for very long. It does seem like there needs to be something. I guess we could look at that two ways. Maybe the solution is to retreat to the old churches, and Christians just have to do missionary work to reconvert people and bring them back, which that's one option that I consider seriously. But also, they're probably, since that's not going to work for everyone, I don't know. Maybe this time will be different. I'll
give a counterexample. So I'll give an example that neither churches nor they are ever particularly pleased with the comparison. But I think communism is by far, the best counterexample to this whole thing.
Okay, yeah.
In that it is a movement that genuinely swept the world.
Yeah, that's true.
That achieved for a while, and its lasting story is probably far from told. But for a while, it achieved influence comparable to Christianity and Islam in terms of directing the hearts and minds of people on a large scale. Yeah. And I wouldn't count it as a success in terms of the ways it achieves that or the things it did directly. But I would say that the structure of it and the way it grew up and the way it impassioned people and such does create a genuine secular example of a religious movement.
Yeah.
And it's been really interesting to me as I've been reading some of the founding texts of it and everything to realize, these ideas are still around. These things are still things that people are thinking about and talking about, directly influenced by these authors. And this ideology has still as powerful hold on some people as these other ideologies. And it does inspire a certain degree of organization and a certain degree of action and a certain degree of so much. Its one grand flaw turned out to be that it was fundamentally a destructive and damaging thing that couldn't actually function.
Mm-hmm.
But it worked to the extent that people believed in it and people fought for it and people built societies based on it and built their lives around it and full-heartedly believed in it.
Yeah. Actually, I agree. I think that is a good example. And I think you're also right that the history of it is not complete. That it's not going to, the future is not going to be like the past. I would hope not, anyway. That people wouldn't just repeat the same things again. But I think that. Are you hearing me, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Just making sure. But yeah, you're absolutely. I mean, it swept the world. Appreciable percentage of the world was really captured, both literally in certain circumstances, but also in their hearts and minds. I mean, a lot of the people in the communist nations really did believe it and find it very compelling. And I think of early, some movements that we could compare it to are very, very old and went through several different versions. So Christianity is 2,000 years old. It's gone through many different stages. It's gone through lots of fits and starts, break-off movements. It's arguable that mainstream Christianity today is not the same as what it was at the start. At least that's one position that could be argued for. So anyway, I guess my point being that communism in its first century and a half, it's if you were to spread that out over 2,000 years and look back at the 19th and 20th century, historians could look back and say, wow, communism had a pretty rocky start there at the beginning. And the orthodox positions before the grand equivalent Council of Nicaea that we might have in the 22nd century or whatever, before that was all established and they were all trying to figure out how it was going to work, was kind of a mess. And basically every world religion has gone through major transformations to become what it is now as well. So, but yeah, I could see communism actually being a kind of secular version of that. It has a full, it really has a full outlook. Not that it has to stay the same. It doesn't have to follow necessarily the dialectical materialism or the metaphysical realism that the theorists like Marx and Lenin adhered to. But just the fact that they're paying attention to those things, that they're thinking of the big questions in politics and ethics and aesthetics, even metaphysics of a sort, that it's that comprehensive does make it seem like it could really be a major life-shaping movement and institution.
Right. And I would say it filled that role. One can hope it won't fill that role again, because I think you can trace institutions fairly effectively back to their roots and see, this is what they were striving for, this is what therefore they'll achieve. And a lot of the things that end up happening from institutions, a lot of the problems with them that happen a ways down the road have their core in problems that were kicking around in the roots of them. And I would say specifically, that's one good example where those problems that were in the roots did very, very much become manifest in such a way to make it clear that, no, this is not something that should persist and grow into that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But it should, I would say, act as a template to remind people that it is not impossible. Mm-hmm. That there is nothing fundamental about religious movements that require a god or gods to be the core motivator.
Yeah.
And I don't even know that, like, you'd want to phrase it in specifically religious terms, thinking about it. Mm-hmm. But just the idea that what does it take to create a shaping institution? Probably God turns out to be a useful component of shaping institutions, but not a necessary component of shaping institutions. Mm-hmm. And so then it becomes, well, if you are aiming towards an audience that is disillusioned with Christianity, what does a shaping institution for that audience look like that takes them in a productive and positive direction? And I think that's a really interesting question to kick around on for a while, but I don't think a political party is the answer, but I think mm-hmm. something akin to it could be.
Yeah. And you think that a political party doing that could be dangerous?
I do. And the reason goes back to, I think if you are engaged in something like this, in getting a bunch of people together to do something, you want them to be doing something that immediately enriches the world, immediately makes things better, regardless of whether others agree with them or regardless of whether others are on board.
Yeah.
And political parties sort of require a critical mass of people to agree with them and require control over a critical mass of uninvolved people to make anything happen. Where I think the institutions that I would be most interested in are the ones that say it doesn't matter. Fundamentally, it doesn't matter what everyone else is doing. We are doing something useful. Mm-hmm. And these are the useful things that you can see us doing right here, right now. And we will continue doing those useful things. And if by chance we gain enough influence to take part in some of these power struggles, hopefully we can translate those useful things onto a broader scale. But you don't need to wait for a promised broader scale to start seeing the fruits of this.
Yeah.
You can see right here, right now, these are the things that we are focused on that are helping.
Yeah. Well, that seems very practical. Especially, it doesn't seem very likely that any one idea or institution would ever capture a majority of a global community. Certainly, there's just so many different perspectives in the world and backgrounds and cultures that trying to get everyone on board. Or that being a necessary component would kind of be a non-starter.
Right. And I think one challenge, just from this broad institution theoretical perspective that, say, Christianity has, is that it does very much, by necessity, indicate a degree of exclusiveness, a degree of this is a necessity in people's lives, and without it, they are lost. And actually, thinking about it, communism has the same thing, and perhaps that's the open question, is can non-exclusive institutions that don't say this is a necessity gain a similar sort of strength. But I think optimistically, the institutions that I feel best about are the ones that say, we are doing specifically what works best for us.
Mm-hmm.
We do not claim that this is necessarily universalizable. We would like to think it is, because it works really well for us. But if you find another method that you're convinced works better, do that thing. But for us, we are going to unapologetically and unambiguously spell out, these are the things that we expect, and these are the ways that we will shape people. And I like the idea of a sort of like deliberate non-exclusivity combined with deliberate, unapologetic, this is our mission, and this is our goal, and this is our approach. And if you are part of us, you do things this way style.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a benign tribalism, or at the level of the nation, it's kind of a benign nationalism.
Yes.
That is not aggressive. It's not trying to harm anyone else. It's just kind of saying, okay, we're this is what we're doing in our sphere, and hopefully it even benefits people outside of our sphere. But we just have to keep things at least somewhat shaped, just to get things done and organized. But and that seems very plausible, just as an effective strategy to be able to kind of divide up, divide and conquer in a way that conquer is not the right word. divide and help. I keep thinking of the effective altruists as you're talking about. Yes. Is that a movement that you follow, or were you thinking of them?
Yes, I like the effective altruists. I think they're good people. One reason I'm so convinced by this idea of non-exclusivity is that I look at the priorities of the effective altruists, and I think they are good, effective priorities. I also do not think that the movement is... I think the movement is non-inclusive in a number of ways, by which I mean I think it focuses on a very specific set of priorities, and it has good reason to focus on those priorities. But you look at it and they say, we are looking for people to either A, earn to give, or B, direct their talents, and we expect them to have very specific and useful talents towards careers in these very useful, under-focused, utilitarian directions.
Yeah.
And I think I'm very, very glad the movement exists.
Yeah.
I don't think the movement needs to be something massive.
Okay. Sure.
And so I think what I would say is even it would be good to have a whole bunch of effective altruism type things that have different focuses. So, their focus is malaria prevention, AI risk, a bunch of things like that. But you can't build a world on malaria prevention and AI risk.
Right, yeah.
You can't build everything on those ideas, even as those are extremely high impact, high value ideas. So something that comes to mind is say, effective altruists will never say it is worth our time to build an inspirational, beautiful building.
Yeah.
You will never see an effective altruist Notre Dame, for example.
Yeah.
And I think in a less quantifiable way, things like that are important for the human spirit. I think in a less, obviously it is vital to, help with disease, help raise the standard of living of people. But I think there is a place for other things. Sheer utilitarian numerical thinking.
Well, and I could see for an effective altruist who's onto the very technical side of maximizing lives saved, that you'd probably want somebody in that type of organization to be very focused and passionate about that specifically, almost like in a crusader-like spirit. But right, I wouldn't want to say like, oh, okay, well, if you're going to study the arts and devote your time to that instead of working to send mosquito nets or malaria drugs somewhere, then that's immoral, or that's a waste of it. And I don't know if that's something they would say or not, but
it's the logical conclusion of the movement.
Okay, so I wouldn't agree with that. But
right, and it is something that, say, Peter Singer, who strikes me as the philosophical core of their movement, would directly say. And that's the sort of thing where, again, I think it's useful to have people who are saying that. I don't think it is useful for everyone to be saying that. And I like to picture sort of the landscape of ideas in general and visualize it and say, okay, who is focused where in the landscape of ideas? And what you see is communities tend to be entrenched in a very specific part of this landscape of ideas, no matter how all-encompassing their intentions, no matter how broad their goals. Say you look at Mormonism, and it's focused towards this interesting and niche subset of things, this Christianity, family history, faith, baptism, whatever, a bunch of these specific things. And you look at effective altruism, and you see Peter Singer, malaria nets, AI risk, a bunch of that. And I think it's really interesting to look at that whole landscape and say, well, how can we make things exploring as much as possible of this landscape in really cool and really meaningful ways? And how can we improve all aspects of that landscape? So I think this is one reason. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was curious. Like, and I don't mean to put you in the spotlight of being the spokesman for the effective altruism, so, but like, say, like after poverty's solved, or like everyone has equal income, and all of the material wants are satisfied. What next is the view, like, okay, then we can move on to other aspects of enriching human experience, or do you know if that's under discussion?
I am not familiar enough with the details to really know. Okay. I mean, there's this stereotypical utilitarian idea of, wireheading and such, where the ultimate thing would just have everyone like hooked up on blissful drugs forever.
Right, yeah.
Which obviously I don't particularly see that as heaven, and I don't think most of them do. But when you're looking at things, and I think there's very much this focus on reducing suffering in the effective altruism movement. And when you're focused on reducing suffering, it's difficult to think in terms of, well, what if there isn't suffering? What next? And so that's that.
Well, because I've kind of thought, I read a book recently I've mentioned to you, This Life. This Life by Martin Hägglund, a Swedish philosopher, a socialist, democratic socialist. And kind of shifted my perspective on that, basically socialism, but also like what is the project, or what's the goal with the way to maximize people's enjoyment of life, and so the just free time. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I listened to a podcast interview with this guy.
Oh, did you?
Checking. Yes, I was checking to make sure, and yes, I listened to an interview with this guy in specific. So yes.
Oh, okay. Well, send me that, definitely. I want to listen to it.
Yeah, for sure.
But what was intriguing to me is this idea of free time, as that's what we want to maximize, because that's where people can do what they want to do. and not just as in to be pathetic or anything, it's just that everyone can choose what they want to do with their lives and find out what their interests are and explore those. So it's much more. That seems more interesting to me, more expansive than survival. Although, of course, survival is very, very important. we have to have that. But it's not just about having everybody work in the factories to produce as much wealth as possible. Yeah, we do want to maximize wealth. We want to have everybody have sufficient for their needs. But really, the reason we're doing all that is to enrich people's lives so that they can spend their lives as much as possible in the ways that they want to do it. So that, they spend the basic amount of time needed to survive and put food on the table, but then have as much time as possible to write, to sing, dance, read, play sports, whatever it is that they want to do.
So this is actually an area where I fairly strongly differ from Haglund in terms of end goals I see.
Okay.
In that, my own life, I have had a great deal of free time in my own life. I think, looking at it in scale, I think an unusual amount of free time, where long periods of having almost nothing but free time. Say, I didn't really work a summer job. I didn't say in high school I didn't work a summer job and such. Or right now, I spent like a year just barely where my job was very much just punch in, sit in a place for a while, and spend all the time I wanted on whatever I wanted to do, as long as I was in this physical space for 6 hours a day.
Yeah.
I spent a year doing that just barely. And as like weirdly privileged, whatever as it sounds to say, I don't think having free time is all it's cracked up to be, unless you have useful structures to fill that free time with. And I think there is a certain subset of people, overrepresented among the people who say write books and stuff, who are very conscientious and very capable of doing things that are extraordinarily fulfilling in their free time. I'm not one of those people.
Okay.
I do not usually find my free time all that fulfilling, and occasionally when I reach through the struggle, reach through the muck, and create something fulfilling, I'm like, hey, this is really cool.
Yeah.
But one reason I like structure so much is that structures have guided me more towards that sort of fulfillment. So I don't think I would be happier or even particularly happy in a world where the goal was to maximize free time. I think there needs to be, so I think I appreciate the message of we don't want to just be working forever. Like, we don't want work to be the defining element of our lives. But I think, therefore, pursue free time is an incomplete conclusion along a more interesting path in response to work. And that's long been the socialist and anarcho-socialist conclusion with things, of just work less, and then if you shorten work days and if you have less working, rejuvenated, and still have plenty of time to work on uplifting and exciting things of all sorts of things, people watch Twitch streams and play video games. That's what happens.
That's a fair point.
And some people, a lot of people will say, oh, that's what they're enjoying. They like, watching Twitch streams and playing video games. To an extent. And I mean, I enjoy them. I play video games. I watch Twitch streams. I do those things. I know what that feels like. And I know that that is not all I would enjoy. But again, going back to people pursue what is most convenient, that is what is convenient to do in free time. And so that is what people do in free time, absent prodding things, saying, what about this? What about this? What about this?
Yeah, and there are different levels of enjoyment too. Like there's immediate enjoyment, and then there's more longer term enjoyment that requires investment and hard work to get the payoff later.
Yes.
And I think that's a very good point. I don't think it's a complete incompatibility, but there's definitely it's definitely a response that I think needs to be taken into account there. And I think you're right. And I could see why, I would assume Haglund is the type of person you were talking about, who's the type who writes books and is very conscientious. I'm pretty much like that too. I'm very productive with my free time. I make a lot of it. But yeah, I agree that that can't necessarily be the default assumption that that's going to be what brings the greatest satisfaction to all people, or that. So, for example, a lot of what I do in my free time is not immediately enjoyable. It's a lot of hard work, but I'm looking at the long-term payoff. But I can see the need for structure, and I think that could be in, like, for example, having an occupation of some kind that isn't necessarily profit maximizing. So, like, there are a lot of occupations today that are kind of considered, you go and get an art degree or a music degree. Well, you're not going to make a lot of money unless you're like, this isn't me saying it. This is like the narrative, right? Because actually, I don't think that's necessarily true. But that's kind of the idea. It's like, what are you going to do with that when you get out of college? The idea, if you want to, what you really need to do is you need to go into business or engineering or medical school or law school. Whereas that wouldn't necessarily be the case if the system were shifted a little bit, right? So there could still be occupations, what do you think? Would that provide structure? If, like, say somebody under current circumstances, the way the system is structured, I need to be an engineer because that's I'm pretty good at it, and that's what'll make the most money. But if I really were to apply myself to my interests, I would be a musician. In another system, maybe that's what they would do instead. Do you think that would address your concern there of providing structure?
No,
I don't think so.
I don't think so. In the sense of, I don't know that that's the most productive way to approach the idea of an occupation. And I say that as someone who takes more or less, who is more inclined towards that sort of approach, I would say. I'm not someone who cares a lot about money. I'm not someone who cares a lot about profit maximization, who cares a lot about, wealth maximization, anything like that. And I have very consciously made decisions away from that direction, and not wanted to pursue the maximally earning path or anything like that. But the fundamental goal of work is to keep the world running. And I think you really want people to be in the mindset with work that a job is not about pursuing your passion. A job is about keeping the world running. And we want to be sure we are doing what it takes to keep things running. In that, I think civilization is fragile. That we feel like it's robust because we have had a time of prosperity and a time of growth and a time of remarkable ease. But it took a lot of sacrifice and a lot of difficult wrestling against very powerful forces of entropy and the like to do any of that. And so I don't think when people think about careers, the sense of my lifetime pursuit should be something I enjoy. I think it should be my lifetime pursuit. In as much as I'm talking about a career, should be something that keeps things running. And in as much as we are sure that the world is stable and things keep running, we build more and more meaningful and beautiful things on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
But the core pursuit of a career is keep the world running.
Mm-hmm. Do you think most people have that high a vision when they're pursuing their career?
I think people have many visions when they're pursuing their career. And I think it is possible to inflame and quiet certain things culturally. And I think you have phrasings like, the Protestant or the Puritan work ethic or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And you have cultures that do very specifically value that sort of idea.
Yeah.
And then you have ones that are, I'm cultures of just monetary focus. And you have cultures of self-fulfillment focus and stuff. And I would say all of those things play a role in everyone's decisions. Different things play different degrees of roles in different people's visions. And my concern is inflaming and quieting certain passions in
Mm-hmm.
certain directions and encouraging civilizationally productive feelings.
Yeah.
And I do think that everyone has a degree of that aspiration in them. Like everyone, to an extent, values the idea of keeping everything running, and to an extent values the idea of being useful.
Mm-hmm.
I think being useful is one of the most fulfilling experiences someone can have. And you want to create as many opportunities as possible for people to feel and be genuinely useful. But no, I don't think everyone will be high-minded about everything all the time, but I think it is possible to make people more in that mindset by the things you say and the way you approach things and the way you frame things.
Yeah. I mean, I think seems to me like most people are just looking to collect a paycheck pretty much. Not that as a matter of fact, their jobs aren't, of course, their jobs are important to keeping society running, but they're not some. At least in my case, I don't think I don't necessarily think of that level most of the time.
Yeah, and I don't think people do exactly, but I do think I look at say the times I've held a specific useful job, or when my younger brother is drifting around and suddenly he jumps into a job, and even if it's with my younger brother, he has worked in very trivial fast food things, and just being engaged in something productive and useful, and even the act of making money and stuff, there is a satisfaction to it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people are consciously saying, yes, I want to keep the world running. I think that's fairly high-minded. I think that the feelings of that enter into things, I think. And should enter into things, mm-hmm. I think. And especially if you can crystallize those feelings and point them out and say, give a name to them, give a focal point for them, be like, this is something worthwhile and this is something that is part of human experience, people become more cognizant of all of that. And fulfillment comes down the line or whatever.
I'll have to think about that. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Not that I'm it's just something I'll have to think about and we'll talk about more.
Right, absolutely.
After I've let it percolate a little bit. Cool. Cool. Well, anything else? What time are we at, by the way?
It's 8:50 at your time.
Oh, that's nice. Okay. Yep. So we've got about 2 hours.
Yeah. That's a healthy amount of time.
Yeah. Anything else you want to talk about?
Nothing else immediately comes to mind. So there are always a billion things that I'm excited to talk about at any given time.
Yeah.
But
it would be fun to it'd be fun to throw in I was thinking maybe 3 people in a conversation at once.
Yeah.
Probably wouldn't be too much, but
no, I think 3, even 4, like,
yeah,
you know, I've heard a lot of conversations like this that you can balance up to 4 or 5 people, I'd say, fairly well. 5 is pushing it, but
cool.
3 to 4 is definitely doable.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank you for taking time just to come on and randomly discuss some issues. It was an interesting experiment. So
yeah,
we'll see. We'll see how we want to build on top of that. And like you said, it's a lot easier than having to plan out a dissertation or anything.
Definitely. It is much lower effort. Again, people do what is most convenient. It is convenient
right.
to sit down and just chat about the ideas that are rolling through our heads and such. And so it's a good way to do things.
Yeah. And I imagine we'll probably develop a kind of, I guess, habit or groove in it as we do more. I guess I'll decide who goes next.
Yeah.
Not that I necessarily have to be involved each time, but I was kind of the one to spearhead it. So
definitely. So yeah, I think it is a very interesting experiment, very interesting project, and I'm excited to see what comes of it.
Well, it's kind of I've been doing so many chats with people remotely between work and just like, there's a friend who I would get with like every couple months, and we haven't been able to meet in person. So I was like, well, okay, let's just go on Zoom, or getting together with my sisters. I was like, well, why not record some of these? That might be kind of fun.
Definitely.
Well, cool. All right. Well, I will talk to you either later tonight or tomorrow. I'm sure, because it's pretty much every day. So,
I will see you around.
All right.
As much as someone sees someone else around in the virtual world. Take care.
All right. Good night.